All right, so this is the keyword for today, basics. And this is the word that doesn't go with this word. So here's a little background on myself. I'm a technical consultant at Acquia, like Ken said. I've been doing that for a little over a year now. So I've traveled all over the country to the most beautiful places like Minnesota and Mississippi, and I'll be in Iowa next week if anyone's planning on vacation. We'd be glad to meet up there. My focus is on best practices, infrastructure, sort of the bigger picture of the technical side. So I'm kind of a nomad technical lead, I guess is the best way to look at it. I've been working with Drupal for about 3.5 years, just about since 6 came out. And previously I worked at Georgia Tech, so I'm glad we have all the important universities represented here. And
why don't you look in my direction?
I don't know, I'm just saying. And before that I was also application developer at IBM, so I've seen the corporate side of this as well. So let's first talk about what deployment actually is. So how many of you guys are developers? How many of you guys are kind of just the site builders, managers? How many of you hate deployment in Drupal? Okay. So we have a common thread. So this is probably what you look like most days. That's actually not me, even though I realized after I took the picture it's actually not that far off. So the most important things of what deployment actually is, it's about maintaining your multiple environments. Everyone has multiple environments, right? No one's writing on production, and right? Okay. And also it's about making those changes effortless. So you want to actually make sure those changes go and they stick, and you don't have to go back and fix them after. And if they do break, you want to make sure that you have a quick solution to fix that. You don't want to have lengthy additional downtime rollbacks. That all comes down to preparation and making sure you have sort of all your bases covered ahead of time. And of course, as you're making the changes, developing the site, you need to make sure you're doing that in a smart way, a sustainable way, so you know what the changes are, what it's affecting, and how the other developers you're working with are going to be impacted. So I always look at it as having 3.5 environments. Your production stage and development are all your server environments, your sort of controlled access environments. And then your local environment is, the Wild West, Macs, Windows, Linux, whatever your laptop has that week. And the biggest things are, production is hands-off. I'm a developer. I completely sympathize with developers. No developer should ever be on production for any reason at all. Staging is the sign-off server. So, if you need to make a little tweak here and there, that's fine. It's something for other people to look at and say, yes, that's good to go, and then promote it to production. And deployment, I always just look at as kind of scratch space for a server. So it's where you get all your developers work together, make sure it doesn't crash and burn, and kind of continue along the process. So all of Drupal can be broken down in sort of 4 different categories: code, configuration, content, and files. Ideally, code and configuration are one and the same. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the end of the presentation. And content and files should only be changed on production. We can discuss that for hours to figure out whether content should be made on production or somewhere else and staged, and that's a different conversation. But ideally, this is the way you deploy a Drupal site. Code and configuration only gets changed at dev and below, and content files only ever gets changed on production.
So I know you said we could discuss this for hours, but I mean, people want to put a whole website into production at once, and you have to have all the files and photos and everything in staging.
Yeah.
And to move to production, so that really doesn't.
That's talking about the site launch, though. This is sort of assuming you already have a site up and you're in the flow. Yeah, site launch is kind of a different. You kind of that does kind of start at stage and then diverge.
Okay.
So that's kind of a different. We could talk about that for another few hours if you want, but in our own little group.
Okay.
So how do you keep this all together? I mean, how many of you guys have had multiple developers working on a shared development box, and you end up changing someone else's code and not knowing why you changed it, and it just turns into a big mess. I mean, that's completely common. That's why that local environment's so important, something where everyone can work in their own space. And even more importantly, how many of you guys actually develop completely in trunk and never leave trunk? You don't have to be shy. Everyone does. And this is what happens when you do that. So you have trunk, one person changes it, the other person changes it, it comes back together on the server, and all hell breaks loose. You have no idea what happened. And these are your project managers down here, especially the guy with the mustache looking at you very disapprovingly. So first, let's talk about what the purpose of branches and tags are. Branches are for actually day-to-day work. It's for new features, it's for a new version of a site, it's something where people are actually committing to over and over. Tags are releases. Once you release a tag, you should never write to it again. Just scrap it, go to a new number, new date, whatever, you should move on. So here's a nice little diagram of what a typical flow should look like. So trunk takes care of all your sort of unreleased, out there development. Once you actually have an initial release, that becomes a particular version. Once you have that version, then active development's on that branch. This is something that's kind of unique to websites from applications. When you're talking about applications, you know, version 8 of an application, version 9 of an application aren't complete rewrites. It's too much to do that. That's kind of a different paradigm. In websites, it's not nearly as hard to go from one complete version of the website to another complete version. So we'll just assume these are complete rewrites. So along the current version, the only releases that should come out immediately are what we're going to call hot fixes. So this is a bug fix. This is how the main Drupal project works. It's code that is just fixing something that was broken, and it shouldn't affect any ongoing development. There's always exceptions, but if you've worked on Drupal 6 since it came out or 5 since it came out, that's a pretty safe assumption. Something that works on 6.2 will work on 6.15 and et cetera. So anything that's just a bug fix, nothing original, you can release from the branch. Anything that's a new feature should come out as a separate branch. So at this point, you do an SVN copy or git branch or whatever technology you're using, and now you'd have your own little working space to work on, whether that's local or somehow on the server. And eventually when that comes back in, you end up with a merge, dealing with all those changes, and then you have a feature release. So as long as you actually are following this and you don't have feature development getting stuck on the branch, and then another feature goes out and comes back in, this is a pretty safe way to do development. So, like I've mentioned, this is best practices. What actually happens in the real world is not this perfect. But if you have something to achieve to, this is, I think, a pretty safe area to look at. And as new features come out, they just always branch out wherever they are, and you just deal with merges as they happen. The reason this is really important is you don't want to have to deal with merges here, because this is something that breaks your website. Dealing with merges here is not such a big deal. So if you separate that, then your boss breathing down your throat at 4:30 on a Friday afternoon, you don't have to deal with merge conflicts because someone's feature is creeping up in your development. You can just get the bug out, push it out, and it's nice and clean. So this is another one that I'm sure we could have a conversation on, is ignoring files in, again, Subversion, Git, whatever tool you use. You should always ignore the upload files directory. I'm working on a project right now where they did not do that, and we have repositories that are 72 gigs because they have all their assets in Subversion. If you've ever checked out a Subversion repository 72 gigs, it probably takes at least an hour. And this is 150 sites in total, so I'm sure you can feel my pain on that. Settings PHP should not be ignored. Everyone's always first response is, oh, but my database password is in there. Who has access to your Subversion? It's your developers. Who has access to your database passwords? It's your developers. Who are you hiding it from? The only people who have access is your sysadmins and your developers. Those are the only two groups you'd want to access your database anyways. So the fear probably comes from, you're hosting on Unfuddle or GitHub or something like that, and you don't necessarily know who has access to it. Most people host internally, it's not a problem, leave it in here.
Well, not to mention, you've also got a lot of sub-level settings in there, like your cookie expiration time, cookie domains, things like that are a little harder to put anywhere else clean.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
And one person changed the cookie domain, and 3 months later someone else changed it, and you have no history of that. All because you wanted to keep this one line out of there.
Well, how do you differentiate between environments though? Because, oftentimes the production environment will have the client's domain, whereas the development environment will have our domain.
That's what Drupal multi-site's for. So you create a different multi-site for default to your production, so it just automatically goes to that. You have a staging folder, a dev folder, whatever other folders you need. That's what Drupal multi-site's designed for.
we've also just put a simple if statement around the database definition line. Check for the current host domain.
Yeah, that's,
I mean, what we've
that's
done
another
is
good option.
just, prod.settings.php, dev.settings.php, and version control
Yeah.
those.
Yeah, and then you just have a symlink you're changing. At Acquia Hosting, what we actually do is we just have a require line that always points to the same place somewhere on the server, and the server actually changes that. So you can have the same settings PHP that always has the same require line, and then the server just changes that file.
Yeah, the Pantheon does that. They put that information in their http.conf file, and they just access that. So the server controls those settings in settings.php.
Yeah. That way, if the database changes, Drupal never has to know about it, so it's another good option. This is one I really, really wish more people would do, is check PHP before you actually let someone commit to it. It's a 2 or 3 line script, it's super simple to do, but if you commit bad code, not only does the next checkout have bad code, but you have a commit that is in your history that is actually broken. So you're going to be looking through your history and looking through changes and wonder why someone changed something and now it's broken. You have no, you're assuming it's correct because it's in Subversion. This is the best way to keep Subversion or Git clean. And if you just look up lint checks on Subversion or Git, you'll find really easy scripts to put that together. So it'll basically scan through all your PHP files or module or install or whatever files. If it finds bad PHP syntax, it'll just block the whole commit. So just keep your repository nice and safe. This is another one that most people, for some reason, forget about, is they don't know about the blame command. If you have multiple developers working on a project, oftentimes you're going to find some weird esoteric piece of code, and you're going to nudge the guy next to you and go, hey, did you put this in here? No, I don't know. We had a contract to leave a couple months ago. I wonder who put that in there. If you're on SVN blame or Git blame, it'll tell you for every line of code who changed it. Who changed it last, I should say. So if it was him and he committed it last, that's what Subversion's for. It's for telling you who did these things. It's telling you who committed it. It's not just for having versions. So don't be afraid to play the blame game. It's a good thing. He'll understand. You probably made a mistake the day before.
Praise and some works.
I don't like that.
Way too positive.
Yeah. So moving configuration to code. Everyone is probably say, oh, you can use that with features. What after features? You hear crickets for like the next 10 minutes. So this is your Drupal configuration, square peg. This is your code, the circle hole. You guys have all been sitting there going, I know what changed in the database, but Drupal doesn't know about it. And now my staging server, I have to go click on this, or I have to tell our QA intern to make sure he clicks the right button when I do this deployment. That's a world of hurt just waiting for you. Not the intern part, the QA clicking part. So I'm sure everyone's used at least some of these at some point. There's sort of the whole CTools family. Whether you know it or not, at least in Drupal 7, views and panels are using CTools. Features X was just next step. Boxes is one most people don't know about. It's basically the whole block system rewritten to be exportable. So if you're creating HTML blocks, boxes will make it to be something you can save. But other than that, it's exactly the same as blocks. And this is a good conversation for Drupal 8 if someone wants to bait me with a question at the end of the presentation. UUIDs and universally unique identifiers might be how things go in the future. It might not be. There's a lot of discussion at DrupalCon about that. And please don't use this. Just please don't use node export and save it to a file and upload it. And the whole point is configuration goes in code, not content. Once you start mixing the two, you've lost all hope. So once you get past features, there's this filling the void issue. So most of your site you can go through and click through, and now you have these great features, modules, exportables. You're ready to go. You think you have it, and then you go, oh, well, I just tried out Workbench, and now my whole site hinders on Workbench, and it's not exportable. And you go, well, if you're not a developer, you're stuck. If you can't write code, you're done. I mean, how many of you guys are site builders again? And if you kind of run into a stumbling block and someone says, oh, we'll just put it in the code, do you look at them funny? Do you fire them? What do you do there? Be nice. So that final 20% of all those modules that didn't have the foresight to make their stuff exportable, I'm looking at you, Workbench, Workflow, most of the core modules don't do it. There's a lot of modules out there that you can rely on heavily during development, and then you realize there's no sustainable way to deploy it. Breaks the entire flow. You have some configuration in code, others you have to click through and add. Once you have both of those pieces, you're no longer deploying. You're no longer automatically deploying. You have a test plan and implementation at every step. It just breaks the whole system. Because all developers and sysadmins know exceptions suck. Once you make one exception, you make two, and once you make two, you've made 300 and your life's horrible. Professionally. I won't judge. So update functions are the answer. How many of you guys have actually written an update function? 3? How many of you guys were developers again? Okay. Just, my math's not good. It's Georgia Tech math, so you know. So this is a built-in Drupal feature. Drupal's already handling managing the update functions, managing what version of a module you're at. It's already doing all of this work for you. All you have to do is write the code that writes to the database. You don't have to manage anything else. So here's a handy little link. So here's the simple example using helper functions. If you need to create a vocabulary and you didn't want to use features, which if you are, I'm glad to know you, you just do exactly what you think you would do. This is what the form's doing. It's filling out these values, saving the vocabulary, and returning some string that says, hey, I imported it fine. That's straightforward if you're a developer. If you're not, this is where Drupal 7 is a little box. But if you can find these modules or these functions, most of which are in Drupal 7, they've done a great job making this easier to manage. You can create your own vocabulary, your own content type, or whatever other structure you used to just pointing and clicking within features. It's a very, very easy to just put that in code as well. What do you think features is doing? If you look at the features module, this is exactly what you'll see for vocabulary, because they stole it from the forum module. Probably the only thing that uses the forum module. So for other fun cases like Workbench, where there is no helper functions to save it, or you don't know what they are, you can always just write to the database from code. Most people see this and they say, oh, well, that's not sustainable, that's not deploying. If the code is only going up and it's only ever meeting at the database at production, this will never have to overwrite code you've already done. This is a very safe way to do it as long as your database is only going down, your code's only going up. So any module in Drupal that's saving to the database, you can just write your own, again, Drupal 7, just in case this looks really cryptic to everyone. This is Drupal 7. And you can just write it manually to the table. There's nothing else to worry about. It's very straightforward. If you don't know what tables you have to look at, whatever module you're kind of losing that missing piece on, you can look at whatever tables it's creating and look in the database. Again, it's not the simplest way, but it will easily accomplish it. I was working on a project last fall where we're migrating a site as well as developing a new one, and our entire deployment framework was a Drush make file and an install profile. That's all it was. So we built the site from scratch. We ran an install profile which ran all these update functions, and every 6 hours we had a completely new populated site without any pointing and clicking anything, because we adhered to everything goes in code. Now that's certainly extreme, but it shows it's easily possible. It's something any developer, anyone kind of familiar with another language at least, can sort of see where this goes to. I want to make, this is a key one that, I mean, how 3 people raise their hand about update functions. I want to make sure this kind of sets into people. So, are there any questions about this? I just want to make sure this is.
So for modules that don't have configuration or aren't exportable, how much work is involved in doing this?
I'd say
Workbench?
I'd say doing all this manually at the sort of the end of the state, I'd say it probably adds maybe 5% of work. Workbench is, I don't know if, have you worked with it or just from, okay. It has its own sort of 4 tables that are separated off. All you have to do is sort of recreate those in here. The way Drupal's designed, it doesn't share tables. So it's not like you have to look through every row of a table and figure out what's applicable. You can just sort of essentially dump the whole table into this, and that will work just fine. Just making sure you don't have anything tied to node IDs or content in it at all.
So are there utilities that read the tables and dump them out into code format?
If you find one, could you email me?
I'll write it and send it to you.
Yeah, exactly.
Module, there you go.
You can replace this with just like a DB query, and then just dump the whole.
Well, that's why I was at, I mean, it seems easy, so.
Yeah, I just, again, this is the best practice version, not the real life, you know, you have to go home at 5 o'clock version. This is the I travel and have way too much free time version. So the next steps. This is kind of, sorry.
I had a quick question regarding update functions.
Yeah.
If you're still working in Drupal 5 and only starting to get into Drupal 6, is there some sort of equivalent for this sort of thing, or?
This is 6, 7.
That's 6, 7.
Yeah.
And 5, what we've done is profiles and taken like profile wizard generator and used that as a similar sort of.
Yeah, same idea.
Okay.
Actually, one thing I didn't mention is, so update functions only run from one version to the next. It does not run for a fresh install. So if you have all these changes and you want to do, like what I mentioned, we have a Drush make and a complete fresh install, it will not run any update functions. If you install a module, it does not run update functions. It just calls install. So your hook install should be sort of the final result of how you want all saved, and then your update is sort of your revisions as you go through. Just thought I'd mention that. So those are all the basics of how to do all this. Now let's look at, once you actually have it all in code and you have everything packaged up and you have your game plan, what are your next steps? You know, this is the key word here, deploying like a pro. If you're deploying by hand and clicking and all that, those are your late nights. If you can deploy automatically, you end up on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean. Not speaking from personal experience, I promise. I was in the Caribbean last week with all of Acquia, for anyone that doesn't. As if that's not a good recruiting pitch, I don't know. So deploying via version control. Everyone's probably seen this acronym, relating to databases or something. The A is atomicity. I don't think it's actually a word. But the idea is you should be able to do either a full deployment or no deployment at all. You don't want to get halfway in between and get stuck. You never run an SVN update for a deployment. That's not atomic. If someone requests something while the update is running, your site's just you're gonna have different versions of different code or missing files, or there's no way to recover from that. Save yourself the headache, do not do SVN update. What you should be doing is an SVN export and then moving that into place. Moves are instant. Moves take no time at all. Changing symlinks, whatever version of that you want to use. That happens immediately. An SVN update can take minutes or however big your repository is. And if you get stuck in the middle, you're going to have some trouble. It could write weird things to your database. You don't want to deal with that. So how do you make sure those deployments actually go through? There's a couple different options. There's post-commit hooks, which apparently in Subversion you can write in Python and all kinds of actual full languages. I did not know that until this week. So when you make a commit, you can automatically push that out to your servers or push it to wherever you want to go. Fairly straightforward. SSH key is your friend. A tool like Jenkins that is going to pull your version control, it's basically a deployment tool that sits off by itself. Or something like Capistrano or Thing or all the Maven or all the other build languages out there that will take whatever code you have and put it on the servers, put it in the right place, put everything how it should be, and then get it out. So those are sort of three different methods. Drush is also your friend when you're looking at deployments. And talking to someone I work with that's one of the co-maintainers of Drush, Drush 5 is going to be really sweet. They're actually looking at doing stuff like Capistrano all within Drush. So actually SSHing files and running update commands and all that automatically for you. So stay tuned. So I mentioned checking out code from version control onto your server instead of an update. This is a good way to sort of double check that or make your developers think twice about actually editing code. Whether they can get to it or not, that's fine. If they have to go through a layer of ownership, then all they can do is look at it, which is probably a good idea. Then they can make sure it deployed. But if it didn't, then they should not be changing those. And then you just point the web server to the new version. I mentioned you can use links or moving a folder, something that's instantaneous. And then these two commands should be run on any update. So once you start writing Drush update or Drupal update functions, Drush up will run all those automatically. So if you write a new one and commit it, run Drush up, now all those click-throughs that a QA intern was having to work through on his spring break, that will take care of. So you can replace your entire intern salary with one command line. And always clear cache. It's never a bad thing, especially because you should only be deploying on nights, weekends, mornings, non-peak times. The one thing I should mention in here is Drush features revert. So if you have features on production and someone's clicked through and changed them, there's a command in Drush that will actually revert all those features automatically. So if you throw that in here, you can revert any bad changes someone made by accident on the production server. Jenkins is the one single sort of specialized tool I want to talk about just because it's gaining more popularity. It's all I've been looking at for the last 2 weeks. The uninitiated call it a fancy cron. It's for running commands at certain points in time. That's how most people use it. That's the simplest part of it. You can have different triggers. So you can trigger it based on committing a source code. You can trigger it based on an IRC bot, a Jabber bot, an email. How to actually trigger it is kind of crazy how many different options are there. Going with the atomic part of a deployment also, you can actually have it run scripts to test if the deployment succeeded before putting them into place. So how many of you guys are familiar with Selenium? Just a couple. Selenium is basically functional testing that is at the highest level of web browsing. So it means go click on this part of the menu. Is this in the next header? Does this return a 404? It's really high level. Essentially, you click through your browser, it records what you did, and then just saves that as a test. So what you can have is your full functional test suite running on your what will be deployed code. If it fails, your code doesn't deploy and it lets you know. That way you don't have to have code that goes out, looks okay, but then breaks your site. Similarly, you can actually have JMeter And in our case, what we're doing is we're actually benchmarking our code as part of the deployment to make sure it hasn't slowed down. So if we find a performance regression, we actually stop the deployment and figure out what happened. So once you use something like Jenkins to have all these other tools integrated, you can actually make your deployments much, much smarter. Not just, you know, the PHP lint check passed and it passed, you know, the eyes of all your developers and it looked okay. You can actually test the real world success of the deployment before it ever gets out there. And of course, these commands will only run at the very end. So you can actually run them in steps. And when you get to an error, it'll just stop at that point. So if Selenium passes, it'll try JMeter. If JMeter fails, it'll kick out the whole deployment. So it can actually go step by step and realize at what point something went wrong and stop there. So I don't blame anyone for saying it's fancy crawling, because at first impression it's really hard to see where it fits in. But this is the sweet spot right here of knowing you can actually make smart deployments that know whether they're successful or not without you having to test it.
What is happening with your production sites? Are you in maintenance mode, or is this happening on a copy of your database in a separate environment?
This should be happening in maintenance mode, yeah, or on one production server at a time, or this shouldn't be happening completely live. The main reason being rollbacks. So if whatever reason you're making database updates and those torch your site, you need something to go back to. Whether you have MySQL dumps or snapshots of the database or file system, or there's tons of options there, but you should have some sort of data method to roll back what you changed.
So do you normally have a staging server and try this on the staging server? And
Yeah.
fails?
Yeah, this should happen on your staging first and then your production. So if your staging server and your production are identical, then you take the chance of an automated deployment, because the odds of something going wrong are tenths of a percent if you have the exact same thing in both places. Where you get into trouble is someone making changes on production and making changes there. That's why one thing I actually do is I do not export permissions. So on the production site, no one has permissions to anything. Drupal permissions, I mean, not file system. So they can't go in and edit views. They can't go in and edit non-content permissions. On staging, they can have a different set of permissions. On development, they can have a different set of permissions. So I export the roles so people are in the right place, but then the permissions I don't set in features or in some sort of exported format to protect production from all the grubby little fingers out there. So I'm going to post these on my website and also SlideShare, and it'll be on Atlanta Drupal site too. I'm actually giving an expanded version of this presentation at Drupal Camp, South Carolina. It's on June 12th, and it's part of the Southeast Linux Fest. So it's Southeast Linux Fest, I think it's 3 days. I think it's the 10th through the 12th. It's drupalcampsc.com or southeastlinuxfest.org. And this is just a one-day part of it that we're having a sort of mini Drupal campus as part of the whole event. So if you're interested in Linux, stay for 2 days. If you're interested in Drupal, just stay for a day. But it should be really interesting. And I'm giving more of the Jenkins, the more advanced part of it, and expanding on that at this event. So, any questions that I can actually answer?
One of the things, and I'm a Drupal newbie at this point, but just being familiar with Subversion and doing things in WordPress and that kind of thing, just getting an initial site set up, just agonizing over, okay, how do I start this the right way? Does the Drupal core go in Subversion? Does it not? Once we launch this site and we have to, 3 months later we have to add a new feature, do we care that, how do we get all the databases synced up and all that kind of stuff? I don't know, maybe it's just an OCD thing with me, but how do you?
So that's why I mentioned this. The initial site launch part of it is sort of a separate issue. My thought is your initial site launch shouldn't have content, or your initial launch shouldn't have content. Your soft launch to get it out to content creators. And from that point forward, excuse me, from that point forward, all of your changes should be in code. So if you're working on the database directly, that shouldn't happen after that site launch. So you have sort of a gold copy. You know, you have some copy that you know is safe for all your updates to run against. So as long as you have that, your initial build doesn't have to be all in code. It's just the issue. The whole reason you should not put changes in the database is because you can't merge database changes. If you have one solid copy that was your initial site launch, then you're not merging any changes, you're only adding to it. So, although I still think all configurations should go in code, if your initial site launch comes with a database dump, that's not going to affect any of your further development as long as you keep, you know, that diagram I had of one of the content and files only going one direction, and that should be fine. So building the site, you can package up the Subversion and package up the database and put them both out there at the same time. What environment and where you put that is, again, a different discussion.
Well, I know features is one way that people are using to try to migrate material to the database by basically putting it into code, in the features module. I've also had a lot of people talk about don't override features, because then someone might go in and revert that feature later and all those overrides get erased. One thing I do not understand about features that I'm hoping you might be able to answer for me, when features execute, does it just move the values from that code into the database, or is it always read from the features folder?
So when you have, so I'll just take views as an example because CTools underneath, same issue. If you have a view in just the database, when you go to the little actions dropdown, you have a delete button. If you have it in code and you've changed it in the database, you'll have an option that says revert and disable. You can no longer delete it. What revert does is it gets rid of the database version. In all of Drupal, the database is authoritative. So if you, whether you like that idea or not, if it's in code and in the database wins, because it assumes those are customizations above and beyond what the code does. So it will override. So if you make a code change, that's why I mentioned the features revert, because if you update the code, but you already have it in the database somewhere, the code isn't going to do anything. So you have to make sure whatever features you change or whatever is changed on the server that could have that sort of conflict isn't in the database.
So what happens then when you press revert on a feature? If it's not deleting what's in the database, what is it doing?
Well, you have to remember, that's why I want to talk about views. Features is a greater set. It's CTools, it's custom exporters for content types and taxonomy and menus, and so when it does a revert, it tells CTools to revert its stuff, and then it does this weird black magic to revert content types and taxonomy, and I don't use features. I don't like it because I tried to write patches for it to do what I wanted, and I have no idea what's going on inside of it. So I stopped using it.
The reason I ask is because I see features as being a wonderful way to set up a database. But then, inevitably, people are going to come around and start changing some of the things that you set up in features. You don't want them then to revert to the feature thing. Is it possible, once you've set up something with a feature, to delete the feature out of your code base and still preserve the database version that features set up to begin with, as a way to sort of make features one way? In other words, you can push things into the database, but you can't go back. What happens if you delete a feature?
Kind of a glorified install file.
Yeah, what happens if you delete a feature? Does that all of those values
Content types and
disappear?
views go away, yeah.
Well,
Do
and
they?
that's the bigger problem,
That's the
though. Is
question.
there's because features relies so much on CTools and has its own stuff. CTools would have to implement that and features separately, which is why it's such a big mess between two. StrongArm's another sort of component of that. Is if you have all these changes, features can just tell all these little subsystems, save it to the database. Features has no control over it. So features, in many cases, is just kind of a UI to something else. It's just the content types, taxonomy, menu. You've seen the list on the module page. Those are the only things features itself is actually doing. So it have to be something that they go to the maintainers of CTools and the maintainers of StrongArm and whatever else is doing it, and they would all have to agree, okay, we need some sort of database save function.
I might help clear this up a little bit. Something that I see that in relating to Linux, that there are some things missing, for example, like package management, like we would have in an operating system, like official
Don't say
maintainers.
App Store. Don't say App
No,
Store.
no, I'm saying package management, as in Debian. And so features is a step in that direction, but what we don't have really is a unified package management system with official maintainers of that code, so that can get stomped on. So maybe in the next year, as it develops, but right now developers are getting frustrated with it for that reason.
So you baited me. So in Drupal 8, you didn't say it, but I'll assume you were. So the way I see it, Drupal 8 will have a CTools export system in it. I completely think that's top priority, has to be done. I don't think all modules will actually implement that until at least a year or two after Drupal 8. Because look at all these modules that get ported between versions and not rewritten. That's a pretty significant. If you've written a module that uses CTools, it's a pretty significant rewrite to how you work with your data. So I definitely think 8 will solve that problem of sort of some underlying common baseline for everyone to work off of. But I'm not sure when 8's released, it'll be sort of replacing everything. I think for a while there'll be sort of, this is the CTools migration path. I don't think it'll be quite clear cut until maybe even Drupal 9, 4 or 5 years from now. But that's top priority. I think that's what Greg Dunlap's initiative for Drupal 8 is, the configuration management and handling all that. So it's definitely one of the top 3 priorities, and it'll get done. And it's just a matter of how many module developers of big modules take that into consideration pre-launch of 8. So when 8 comes out, we have this beautiful configuration management system. And that's, until core controls it, people aren't going to agree on, just like CCK. For a long time, there's a lot of stuff that used these weird pseudo fields on content types and kind of wrote their own stuff like workflow. And now that CCK is in core, you see all those things starting to come back together. Or fields in core, all that's coming back together. So I'm sure configuration management will follow the same routine for 8.
Have you found any particularly good resources on learning Jenkins, websites or books or anything?
No. And part of it is don't search for Jenkins, search for Hudson.
Yeah.
So
Jenkins is a fork of Hudson.
Oh, I didn't know that.
So Sun thought they owned the Hudson name, so the developers of it said, we're open source, we're going to take it and just rename it, and now you can't control it anymore. So there's a whole legal, Oracle, not Sun, sorry. There's a whole Oracle legal copyright trademark thing behind that, but
Jenkins. Go ahead and use it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, Jenkins is open
The
source
community
now.
basically went away and forked Hudson and made it Jenkins.
Yeah.
Now the latest
So Jenkins is Hudson.
Jenkins is Hudson. Yes.
Same thing happened with OpenOffice, and we'll see what happens with MySQL and all the other ones. But so even on the Jenkins site, they have Hudson mentioned in there. So if you can't find it for Jenkins, look for it on Hudson. But if you can't find it on Hudson, it's probably not out there. A lot of it.
Oracle is actually giving Hudson over to the Eclipse Foundation, so I don't know what's going to happen.
Oh, that makes it much easier.
Yeah,
All right.
If you don't recommend using features, what do you recommend? What's a recommend?
Code. I mean, it's the same reason in some cases I don't use views, just because I'll put it in the code. But it's not that I don't recommend using it, it's just that I don't use it. It's because I know all the tricks to get around it and do the other stuff. If you're just a user of features, it'll probably never cause problems other than the reverting issue. But that's something that's within the UI, and you know it's been overridden, and it's pretty clear cut. So it's not that I don't recommend people using it. It's just if you know the other way to do it, it's a little more foolproof because you don't have all the logic of overriding a feature and dealing with all these changes out there. So I don't want to say it's a bad thing at all. It's just you know, it's the same reason if you don't use something like custom pages when you can just write it all in the theme. You know, it's just you're just taking on another layer of complexity.
Another question is on the staging server. You mentioned that this production server. Do you recommend have this database shared? Is that no? Separate database?
What makes it a separate environment is having a separate database.
But if the staging server does not have exactly a copy of the production data content,
Right.
things
So
could be broken.
So this arrow is not a one-time thing. When you release a new something to production, you know it's okay. That database goes back down to stage and dev. So that way they are always in sync. So it's something that is always going down and always going up. It's not that it's, you know, you kind of put production out there and you
So
leave
it's
it.
separate, but it's in sync. Okay, that's what you're saying.
Yeah, so you know, when you get through a production a release cycle or sprint or whatever, you dump this and put it in stage and dev. That way you know you have the same starting point. Any other questions?
Any recommendation for development tool? Like what kind of tools are you using for your development? IDE or debugging?
That's another fun question. I use NetBeans mainly because it has good support for Subversion. It has good support for debuggers, and it has really good highlighting and code completion and all that, and it's free and not owned by a larger
Have you
foundation.
compared that with Eclipse?
It's all for Drupal development. It's probably practically one-to-one. There's probably not a lot that Eclipse has that NetBeans doesn't have, and NetBeans doesn't have that Eclipse doesn't have at the Drupal level. They're comparable.
Eclipse works pretty well, especially if you drop in one of the Drupal plugins, so it'll recognize your module file name extensions, things like that.
Git versus Subversion.
Why are you asking me all these opinionated questions? Is someone going to ask me about the App Store?
Should Drupal have an app store?
I think if you need to learn a version control system, you should learn Git now, because that's where everything's going. If you have, you know, less than 5 developers, I don't think it makes that much of a difference. I'm not one of the people hugely on the Git bandwagon. Having said that, that's all I use. And in a lot of cases, what I think makes the most sense is especially corporate, you know, larger people working in Drupal, they have a Subversion server already. And what I usually do, Acquia hosting is another case. We do Subversion. I use Git locally. So I use Git locally to manage local branches, local changes, all the nice stash functions in Git, and the server stays Subversion. So there is definitely a happy medium there. Any other questions? Everyone's going to go back, and now they're going to have a fully, perfectly deployed site now, right?
Then you have to train the other developers on it.
Then we have to actually learn all of that stuff.
Yeah, that's why the slides are online, so you can learn it tomorrow. All right, thanks, guys.